Hey everybody, welcome back in another video. So today I want to talk about Carolyn Cassady's book, Off the Road, 20 Years with Neal Cassady, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg. So I first read this book about 10 years ago, and then I reread it this past week. But the first time I read this book, I remember being very, very captivated by it because this story kind of filled in all of the missing pieces and gaps of the story that I already knew, the life of Jack Kerouac, Neal Cassady, and just the Beat generation in general. So I felt like this book kind of gave a very fresh perspective because it just filled in all these missing pieces in the story that I already knew. But this time around, I just got off of, reading a bunch of Beat generation stuff over the past 6 months. So I felt like it kind of was rehashing a lot of the same story that I've heard many times. Because a lot of the Beat generation stuff, it's just telling the same events, just from different people's point of view, during this time period in late 1940s through the 1950s. But this book was published in 1990, so well after all of the core books of the generation were written in the 1950s. So Carolyn Cassady is definitely a Beat generation writer, but she just wrote this book much later than all the other well-known Beat generation authors. But regardless of that, I would say this book is one of the core books of the Beat generation. It really tells the story of all these different people in the Beat generation, just kind of ties it together into one cohesive narrative, and really see what a central person Carolyn Cassady was in the events that were going on within the Beat generation. But anyway, so like I said before, this book is kind of telling the same events of books I've already done reviews on in the past many weeks here, many months here. So I'm not going to go through all of the events that take place in this book. I'm just kind of going to go through some of my most interesting things, major takeaways that I found from this book, reading it this time around. But you definitely see very early on in the book that Neal charmed and persuaded his way into Carolyn's life, because he's the kind of person that if he wants something, he's going to get it. And that happens to be being in a relationship with Carolyn or marrying Carolyn. That's what Neal Cassady is going to get. But it's kind of sad seeing very early on how unfaithful Neal was to Carolyn. Even before they got married, she was very aware of how unfaithful he was and all the horrible things that he did to her in the relationship. So seeing what a difficult life Neal made for Carolyn much later on in her life, all the warning signs were there very early on. It should have been no surprise to her before she married him what kind of husband he was going to be. And she says some kind of strange things in this book. She talks about how her love to Neal, it didn't have any romance or physical attraction. And she said that her love for him was based on being rational, not based on being, physically attracted to him. And it's just kind of strange because if you're not, physically attracted, or you have no romance, or you feel no romance with the person you're with, what is the point of being with him? And she talks about how she just felt like it was predetermined, it was predestined that she was going to be with Neal, and that was the main driving force in her attraction to him. But I think that kind of shows that the driving force in the relationship was actually Neal just manipulating Carolyn. He just kind of manipulated her to really have no choice but to be with him. And she talks about how I think her idea of it being predestined, which is kind of her way to justify the way that he treated her. But what this is really getting at, I would say the main central theme in this book is Carolyn trying to describe her religious beliefs based on the ideas of Edgar Cayce. And she used that to justify being with Neal. And the ideas of Edgar Cayce, these religious ideas, which I'm not going to get into too much detail about these ideas specifically, they just kind of are a lot of mysticism and ideas of predestiny and past lives, just kind of combined into all these various religious ideas that Edgar Cayce had. And one of the core things in Edgar Cayce's teachings are these readings that they do. And Neal and Carolyn, during their life, they had this organization that was based off the ideas of Edgar Cayce, did these readings of their past life. And they got these recordings of this person who just kind of told all of their past lives. And in these readings, they explained that Neal and Carolyn had been together in past lives. And it kind of just shows that it was predestined that they were going to be together again in this life, because they just kind of found each other in different lives again and again. And that just kind of works to, I think, help Carolyn justify being with Neal, because Neal treats her so bad, and she just kind of says, oh, well, it was destiny. We've been together in all these other lives, so it was destiny that we're going to be together again in this life. It's just kind of sad to to see her justifying Neal through these ideas. But these really aren't ideas that I subscribe to by any means, but these ideas really remind me a lot of Scientology. The way that Scientology kind of combined religion, psychology, and pseudoscience together to create this philosophy that people use to live their lives. And I see a lot of similarities between Edgar Cayce and the ideas of Scientology. But what I think this is really getting at is that during this time period, this is also when Scientology was starting to begin to emerge in this post-war America. But in the post-World War II America, there's a lot of changing values and ideas. And I think that the ideas of Edgar Cayce are kind of lumped into that. And all these changing values in America, I think, contributed to the counterculture movement that emerged in full force in the 1960s. And there's a lot of people who had ideas that were becoming very mainstream during this time period. People like Carl Jung, Abraham Maslow, Aldous Huxley, Ram Dass, even people like Timothy Leary were just creating all these new ideas that people were using to just change the way that they saw the world. And I really see, I think, in Carolyn Cassady that the way that she describes a lot of these ideas just seems kind of naive, the way that she sees things. I think this is kind of, it was very common during this time period for people to really lock on to all these new ideas and beliefs. But I think during this time period, people really believed that, just an idea itself could really just change the world overnight. And I really see that in the way that Carolyn Cassady writes and in the way that she thinks. I think she's a good representation of how people were looking for new ideas during this time period. During this time of a lot of conformity, people were just looking for something that was different. I think she's a good representation of that in the way that she was very interested in the ideas of Edgar Cayce. But yeah, that's definitely a main part of this book. I feel like her goal in this book was really to describe all of her religious ideas and how she developed them, how she came about them. But it's interesting to see how she thought, and just I think it's a good representation, like I said, of how people probably thought during this time period. And I think a lot of the Beat Generation was like that. All the people of the Beat Generation were very interested in new ideas, and that kind of contributed to the counterculture movement in the 1960s. And Carolyn Cassady is not really someone that I associate with the 1960s counterculture. I think she's very rooted in the 1950s when she was in a relationship with Neal Cassady and Jack Kerouac and all those people. But at the end of this book, some things that I found interesting. This book tells about when Carolyn got Neal's ashes. This woman named J.B., who was with Neal when he died in Mexico, she brought his ashes to Carolyn when she left Mexico and came back to the United States. And J.B. had this weird obsession with Neal's ashes. She was always trying to see them, always wanted to look at them and know where they were. And she would come back to Carolyn's house to try to see the ashes again. And Carolyn had to keep shooing her away. But it was just kind of weird to read about how obsessed this lady J.B. was with Neal's ashes. But I think it just kind of demonstrates how magnetic of a person Neal was. People were just obsessed with him. And the way that he manipulated people, I think he just manipulated people to be very obsessed with him. And he was just kind of, I think, an infectious person in people's lives. And you see this woman, J.B., was just obsessed with him, just obsessed with the idea of his ashes after he died. And this book talks a little bit about Carolyn's friendship with Jack Kerouac after Neal died. I don't think she actually saw Jack again after Neal died, but she talks about how Jack Kerouac would call her quite a bit. And there was one scene in this book where it was one night where he was just calling her again and again and again and just driving her crazy. And she was just like telling Jack to stop calling me. But Jack Kerouac was not the same person, I don't think, in the late 1960s that he was in the 1950s. He just was a very jaded, conservative person, just a very sad alcoholic. And I think the way that he treated people wasn't very nice anymore. But I'd also find it interesting that Neal Cassady died in 1968. Jack Kerouac died in 1969, very close to each other. And it just represented the end of an era. And you see that Neal Cassady and Jack Kerouac just kind of destroyed themselves, just kind of burned themselves out until their lifestyle killed them. But it's interesting that they both died right at the peak of 1960s counterculture, but also I feel like by the late 60s, the 60s counterculture was kind of already starting to die out. It had reached its peak and was just kind of burning itself out. But Neal Cassady and Jack Kerouac, who were really the central icons in early American counterculture in the 1950s, died right at the height of all the 60s counterculture. So it just feels like a perfect storm of this era coming to an end in the late 1960s. But this book here really describes that time period, describes her relationship with Jack Kerouac and Neal Cassady, and just kind of puts it together into one real cohesive narrative. And you definitely see that Carolyn had a very difficult life. I mean, she raised 3 kids with a husband who was hardly ever around, always traveling, always being unfaithful, having affairs on the side. So I think it's just incredible to see how Carolyn Cassady made it through all of that and raised 3 children and was able to live, to publish a book about her life. But this book is really good in the way that it just tells the full story of this idea of the Beat Generation. All these central figures in the Beat Generation just kind of ties all together into one narrative. So definitely would recommend reading this. This, like I said, is one of the, I'd say, core central books in the story of the Beat Generation. It was written in the 1990s, so well after all the main events of the Beat Generation. So it's also interesting in that regard that it was written so much later. But yeah, that's Off Road by Carolyn Cassady. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.